Hello, once again, psychology students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for part two of Module 7. We're going to talk a little bit about the cerebral cortex. So, the cerebral cortex basically contains the intricate fabric of the interconnected neurons that form the body's ultimate control and information processing center. The brain's wrinkly outer surface, for the most part, is what makes up the cerebral cortex, and it covers the lower level brain structures. If we were going to try to start counting up the number of neurons here, anywhere between 20 to 23 billion neurons exist in the layer of the brain tissue that's only about an eighth of an inch thick. So if you take a look at the diagram that we have over here in the gray, this layer between the red and the yellow, that would be our cerebral cortex. And the fact that there are so many billions and billions of neurons is very, very overwhelming. The more wrinkly our surface of the brain, probably the more neurons that we could probably count. So, the cerebral cortex is the highest brain center in humans. This is where sensory processes like vision, hearing, taste, smell, and motor functions all take place. It's a layer of gray colored neurons under the skull um, that are protected by what is known as the cerebrum or the bark. And it's estimated that three-quarters of the cerebral cortex has really no known special function. Parts of the cerebral cortex can be damaged without a loss of general intellectual ability. So there is a lot of mystery that kind of surrounds the cerebral cortex, and we are still learning lots about it in the modern day and age. Along with this, there is what we call the neocortex. Anytime that we see the prefix neo, we're talking new. This is the outside part of the brain, the tree bark, the folds, the wrinkles, basically the area we've been talking about. But 80% of the brain's weight kind of comes from this. In humans, it's the most developed, higher up in classification and development if it has more wrinkles. It's kind of like a crumbled up piece of paper that you try to fit in a small area. The more that you can crumble it up, the more area you can kind of take in. And so the idea is that the more wrinkles we have, obviously, probably the more area that we have as far as storage of information. Along with that, our cortex is divided into two hemispheres, a right and a left hemisphere that are joined together with a band of tissue known as the corpus callosum. Okay, it basically functions when we dream and reason and talk and hear and all those kind of wonderful functions. Um, the thing about the corpus callosum, though, it is possible that in extreme cases, and usually it's cases where an individual is having severe epilepsy, that band of tissue that connects those two hemispheres could be divided. Now, to draw your attention to the fellow that you see here in the middle of our page, he's not winking at you, but he is a very famous man when we talk about the study of the brain. His name is Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage had worked on the railroad back in the 1850s. And one day, him and his crew were using blasting irons, and one of the irons actually went right through his head. And you can kind of see the diagram here to the left that kind of shows the skull. What you see in his hand in the photograph is actually the blasting rod. But what's fascinating about Phineas Gage is he survived the injury. And that kind of made him unique because most of the time, if you would have that kind of injury, obviously you would probably die. His personality changed dramatically. He had kind of been like a happy go lucky young man. And after having this rod go through his head, his personality changes from being kind of lighthearted to being very, very sad and angry. And I guess it probably doesn't surprise me that that's kind of what happened to his personality, but uh, he becomes a test case. And what we know about regions of the brain and their functions. And in a way, we still come back and we talk about Phineas Gage, but there have been others very similar to him because of some kind of neurological accident that we have gone back and we have examined to see if we can learn more about the functions of the different structures of our brain. All right, major divisions of the cortex. First, we're going to talk about the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is this long division. It's basically separating the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And if you would pull the fissure open, you would notice that right and left hemispheres connected again with the corpus callosum. And that's your next item here. It's that large band of neurological tissue that connects the two hemispheres and allows both hemispheres to communicate with one another. Along with that, we have the different lobes of the brain, and there are roughly 4 lobes that we need to talk about. The frontal lobe, which is obviously located kind of in the frontal area of the brain near your forehead. This contains certain activities like your ability to plan and, for the most part, to organize materials. It includes, along with this, the cerebral cortex that's located on both right and left hemispheres. This enables us to do a lot of our advanced cognitive abilities like judgment and planning. This lobe is the largest of all the 4 lobes. And if there would be damage to this, this would probably take out a person's ability to reason, maybe to think long term or short term. So, we are very concerned about this, and especially during adolescence. I mentioned yesterday that, we go through kind of a synaptic pruning when we talk about neurons. As we go through adolescence, we're kind of making new connections in that frontal lobe. So we want to make sure that we are exposing adolescents to information and activities that are going to help grow their cognitive abilities. Other areas, we have the parietal lobe, and this is a portion of the cerebral cortex that lies basically at the top of the head, kind of near the rear. It's basically adjacent to the frontal lobe, and it contains something known as the somatosensory cortex. This cortex contains a lot of general association areas involved in the processing of information. So it does a little bit with the reasoning of math and integration of memory. This lobe, for the most part, processes sensory information such as touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and your body position. Along with that, we have what is known as the occipital lobe, kind of located towards the back portion of the head. This includes the primary visual cortex, and this is a processing area for sight and visual information. If there is damage to the structure, it can lead to partial or perhaps even full blindness. And then finally, the last of the lobes, it's the temporal lobe. This is the portion of the cerebral cortex that lies roughly just above the ears and includes auditory hearing areas of the brain. This lobe processes and interprets sound, taste, and smells. This lobe helps us understand and comprehend language. So if there would be damage here, we wouldn't necessarily be able to understand words that are being spoken to us. When we talk about movement and feeling, along the kind of the far portions of the frontal lobe is something known as the motor cortex. It's actually adjacent to the somatosensory cortex, but the motor cortex in your right hemisphere controls movement on your left side of the body. And when we talk about the motor cortex in the left hemisphere, it obviously controls movement on the right side. Along with that, we have, again, the somatosensory cortex. This is along the parietal lobe, helps us register and process body sensations. The cerebrum, the largest part of the brain, consists of the 2 cerebral hemispheres. We've mentioned this before, but you have the sensory cortex that helps us receive sensory messages. And again, the motor cortex, again, that helps us transmit messages to muscles and controls all intentional body movement. Thank you very much.